is accused of killing a 34-year-old woman in a building near 70th and Normal. Police arrested him on Thursday, about 2 blocks away from where her body was found.
December 9th, 2024 started like any other ordinary day. 14-year-old Terryn Stanton walked home from school through the cold streets of Englewood, Chicago. His backpack hung loosely over one shoulder, and his mind was probably on the same things most teenagers think about after school: food, rest, maybe a little time on his phone. But the moment he stepped inside the abandoned building he shared with his mother, something felt off. The place was quiet, too quiet. "Mom," he called out. No answer. That wasn't normal. His mother, Terryn Winters, always responded when he came home. Even if she was in another room, she'd usually shout back, asking how his day went or telling him there was something to eat. But this time, nothing. Terryn pulled out his phone and tried calling her. It rang, then went straight to voicemail. He tried again. Still nothing. At first, he probably assumed she had stepped out for a moment. Maybe she ran to the store or went to talk to someone nearby. But minutes turned into longer stretches of silence, and that uneasy feeling in his stomach started growing stronger. Then something even stranger happened. Posts began appearing on his mother's Facebook account. The messages were weird. The tone didn't sound like her. The words didn't feel like something she would ever write. Friends and family members started noticing too, commenting and messaging, asking if she was okay. Terryn stared at the screen, confused. This didn't feel right. Someone had his mother's phone, and deep down, he already knew something was terribly wrong. But the real horror? It was still hidden. Just above Terryn's head in the attic, where he slept every night, was the truth no child should ever have to face. His mother's lifeless body had been left there. While Terryn walked through the house, searching for her, she was already gone. And the person responsible? Someone she had trusted. Someone she had allowed into her life. Someone who, according to investigators, exploded in rage over something unbelievably small. $7. A single argument, a moment of anger, and a decision that would destroy an entire family. So how did a struggling mother, trying to rebuild her life, end up becoming the victim of such a brutal act? And how did a man with a dangerous past get close enough to take everything from her? Before we uncover the disturbing details, if you're drawn to true crime stories that make you stop, think, and question the world around us, make sure you're subscribed to the True Crime Shadow. This channel dives into real cases that reveal the darker side of human choices and the systems that sometimes fail the people who need protection the most. Now let's go back to the beginning, because the story of what happened that day didn't start with violence. It started with a mother trying to survive. Terryn Winters. She was 34 years old. To friends and family, she was better known by the nickname China. And if you ever met her, you probably wouldn't forget her easily. Terryn had a bold personality that filled whatever room she walked into. She loved experimenting with multicolored hair, often changing it depending on her mood. Bright makeup highlighted her confident style. Around her neck, she almost always wore a purple cross necklace. That necklace meant something to her. It wasn't just an accessory. It represented faith, a quiet reminder that no matter how difficult life became, she believed there was still something better waiting ahead. People who knew Terryn often described her the same way, the life of the party. She had a way of bringing energy into a space. When she laughed, people laughed with her. When she spoke, people listened. She had warmth that made strangers feel comfortable and friends feel valued. But behind that bright personality was a woman carrying the weight of real struggles. Because more than anything else, Terryn was a mother. Her son, Terryn Stanton, was just 14 years old, and he was the center of her entire world. Their relationship went deeper than the usual parent and child dynamic. Terryn didn't just see her as his mother. He saw her as his best friend. They faced life together. When times were hard, it was the two of them against the world, and life had become very hard. Like millions of people across the country, Terryn's stability began to crumble during the pandemic. The job she depended on disappeared, and one steady income vanished almost overnight. As the months passed, financial pressure grew heavier. Inflation drove prices up, rent became harder to manage, and finding stable housing became an uphill battle. What started as a temporary setback slowly turned into a housing crisis. Eventually, Terryn and Darren found themselves doing something no family ever plans for. For a time, they began staying in an abandoned building in Englewood, a neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. The building had been damaged by a fire months earlier. Most people avoided it entirely. But for Terryn and Darren, it became a place to rest their heads while they tried to figure out their next move. It wasn't safe, it wasn't comfortable, but it was shelter. And even in those circumstances, Terryn refused to let her son's life fall apart. Every morning, she made sure Darren went to school. His education mattered to her. His future mattered to her. She believed that if she could just get through this difficult season, things would turn around. And there were signs that hope might be coming. Terryn had applied for housing assistance in Indiana, hoping to relocate and start fresh away from the struggles that had piled up in Chicago. She believed approval could come any day. In her mind, this was only temporary. Soon, she and Darren would move somewhere safer, somewhere more stable, somewhere they could rebuild their lives. She had plans. She had hope. She had dreams of giving her son a better future. But while Terryn Winters was trying to rebuild her life piece by piece, another story was unfolding nearby. A man had just returned to the streets after more than a decade behind bars. His name was Antoine Chambers. He was 32 years old, and earlier in 2024, he had been released from prison after serving 12 years for a violent criminal offense. When he walked out, he didn't return to a normal life. Instead, he was placed under strict supervision as part of his release conditions. Chambers was required to follow a long list of parole rules. He was living in a halfway house in Englewood, only a short distance away from the same abandoned building where Terryn and her son were staying in Chicago. And there was something else about him that raised serious concerns. His name was listed on the Illinois State Police Sex Offender Registry, a public database meant to monitor individuals convicted of certain violent crimes. On paper, the system was supposed to keep communities safe. Chambers' parole conditions were strict. Authorities had the power to supervise his movements and monitor his behavior. In theory, those safeguards existed to prevent another tragedy. But rules on paper don't always stop danger in real life. Somewhere in the weeks leading up to December 2024, Chambers crossed paths with Terryn. Exactly how they first met remains unclear. But according to reports from investigators and people familiar with the situation, Chambers began visiting the abandoned building where she and Darren were staying. At first, it may have seemed harmless. Maybe he presented himself as someone who understood hardship, someone trying to rebuild his own life after prison, someone who simply needed a conversation or a friend. And Terryn had always been the type of person who saw the good in people. But investigators later suggested Chambers may have wanted something more than friendship. He reportedly hoped for a romantic relationship with Terryn. The problem was that feeling wasn't mutual. According to authorities, Terryn rejected his advances. What might have seemed like a small moment, just a woman setting a boundary, may have created something far more dangerous inside Chambers. Because rejection doesn't always end quietly. Sometimes it turns into resentment. Sometimes it turns into anger. And over time, that tension between them began to grow. Small disagreements, uncomfortable interactions, the kind of friction that slowly builds beneath the surface, until eventually, something pushes it over the edge. December 9th, 2024 began like an ordinary day for Darren Stanton. That morning, the 14-year-old got ready for school just as he had done countless times before. despite the uncertainty surrounding their living situation. His mother, Terryn Winters, was determined to keep some sense of normalcy in his life. School mattered to her. His future mattered to her. So Terryn left the abandoned building in Englewood and headed to class. Terryn stayed behind. For her, it was supposed to be another quiet afternoon. Another day waiting for the opportunity that could finally pull them out of the difficult situation they were living in. But at some point that day, someone else arrived at the building. It was Antoine Chambers. According to investigators, Chambers came to the property while Terryn was away. Security cameras in the area would later capture the two of them entering the building together. What happened next would unfold out of sight. Authorities say that at some point, Chambers convinced Terryn to go up into the attic of the building. The reason isn't entirely clear. It may have been a conversation, a request for help, a private place to talk. But once they were up there, something changed. Investigators believe an argument began between them, and it quickly escalated. The disagreement reportedly centered on two things: Terryn rejecting Chambers' advances and a dispute over $7. $7, an amount so small it's almost impossible to imagine it leading to violence. But in that attic, the situation spiraled out of control. According to prosecutors, the confrontation turned physical. Chambers allegedly attacked Terryn with a pipe wrench, striking her repeatedly. The assault, investigators say, was not quick. It was brutal and prolonged. Inside the attic, there were no witnesses, no one to hear the struggle, no one to stop what was happening. By the time the violence ended, Terryn Winters was dead. But what happened next made the situation even more disturbing. Instead of calling for help or fleeing immediately, investigators say Chambers began using Terryn's phone. First, he allegedly took photographs of her body. Then he opened her financial app and transferred $7 to himself using Cash App, the same amount they had reportedly argued about. $7. After the transfer, authorities say he attempted to cover his tracks. He deleted his contact information from her phone, hoping it would remove any clear connection between them. He later discarded the phone in a nearby alley. But in the chaos of leaving the scene, Chambers made one critical mistake. He left something behind. A gray hat. At the time, it probably didn't seem important. Just another piece of clothing. But investigators would later match that hat to the one Chambers was seen wearing on nearby surveillance cameras. A small detail, a small mistake, and one that would soon become a key piece of evidence. But the most disturbing part of the story hadn't even happened yet. After the violence ended in the attic, investigators say Antoine Chambers didn't immediately disappear. Instead, he did something that would send a wave of fear through Terryn Winters' family and friends. Using her phone, Chambers allegedly began posting messages on her Facebook account. At first glance, the post might have looked like ordinary updates. But the people who knew Terryn best immediately felt that something was wrong. The words didn't sound like her. The tone was strange, cold, unfamiliar. Friends scrolling through their feeds began noticing the posts appearing one after another. Some tried to brush it off at first, assuming maybe Terryn was upset or venting. But the feeling in their stomachs kept growing. This didn't feel right. This didn't sound like China. Family members began messaging her privately. They called her phone, but there was no response. The person posting wasn't answering questions. The posts continued, but they didn't make sense. They lacked the warmth and personality that everyone associated with Terryn. To the people closest to her, it felt like someone else was behind the screen. And in a way, they were right. While those unsettling posts were appearing online, Terryn Stanton was still at school, unaware that anything had happened. Later that afternoon, he walked back to the abandoned building where he and his mother had been staying, just like any other day. But the moment he stepped inside, something felt wrong. The house was quiet, too quiet. He called out for his mom. No answer. He pulled out his phone and called her. The call went straight to voicemail. He tried again and again. Still nothing. Confused and growing anxious, Terryn opened Facebook, and that's when he saw the posts. Strange messages appearing on his mother's account. Messages that didn't sound like her. His heart began to race. Something about them felt off. Something about them felt wrong. Terryn knew his mother better than anyone, and he knew those weren't her words. Panic started creeping in. He called her again. No answer. Now the fear was impossible to ignore. A 14-year-old boy, standing inside an abandoned building, realizing something terrible might have happened to the person who meant everything to him. So Terryn did the only thing he could think to do. He called 911. He told the dispatcher his mother was missing. He explained the strange posts appearing on her account. He told them where they were staying. Within a short time, police officers arrived at the building on Chicago's South Side. They stepped inside and began searching the property room by room, then the hallways, calling out her name as they moved carefully through the damaged structure. But there was no response. Eventually, investigators made their way toward the attic. It was a place Terryn was familiar with, a place where he sometimes slept. But when officers entered the attic space, the search suddenly turned into something far more serious. Inside, they made a horrifying discovery. The body of Terryn Winters was lying there. The scene immediately told investigators that this wasn't an accident. It was a violent crime. The attic quickly became an active crime scene as detectives and forensic teams began documenting everything they could find. Not far from the body, investigators located what they believed to be the weapon, a pipe wrench. There was visible blood evidence throughout the space, confirming the brutality of the attack prosecutors would later describe in court. But that wasn't all. Lying nearby was a gray hat. At first glance, it might have seemed insignificant. Just another item left inside a rundown building. But experienced investigators know that even the smallest details can matter. That hat would soon become an important piece of the puzzle. While forensic teams worked inside the attic, detectives began looking beyond the building itself. They started reviewing security camera footage from nearby homes and businesses in Chicago. And what they found helped build a clearer timeline of what had happened that day. One camera captured Antoine Chambers walking toward the building with Terryn earlier in the day. Another camera showed him leaving the property later, but this time he was alone. That footage raised serious questions, and investigators were about to find even more evidence connecting him to the crime. During their search of the surrounding area, officers located Terryn's phone discarded in a nearby alley. When digital forensic specialists began examining the device, the information inside painted a disturbing picture. According to investigators, the phone contained photographs taken after the attack. There was also a financial record showing a $7 transfer through Cash App sent from Terryn's account. And even though someone had attempted to remove certain contact from a phone, forensic analysis revealed traces of a deleted contact record connected to Chambers. Piece by piece, the evidence began forming a timeline. A violent attack in the attic, the phone being used afterward, the suspicious online posts, the discarded device in the alley, and surveillance cameras placing Chambers at the scene. With this growing body of evidence, investigators quickly focused their attention on one person, Antoine Chambers. But by the time police connected all the dots, he was already gone. Authorities launched a manhunt across Chicago, searching for the man they believed was responsible for the brutal killing of Terryn Winters. But while investigators searched for the suspect, a grieving family was left trying to understand the unimaginable. News of Terryn's death spread through Englewood with the speed of shock. In neighborhoods where people were already used to hearing about violence, this case felt different. Maybe it was the cruelty of it. Maybe it was the way it unfolded above the home of a child who had no idea what horror was hidden just feet above him. Or maybe it was the sheer senselessness of it all. A mother killed inside the very place she was trying to build a life for her son. Within days, neighbors began gathering outside the abandoned building where Terryn had been living. Flowers appeared first, then candles, then handwritten notes taped to the fence surrounding the property. Rest in peace, Terryn. Justice for Mom. You deserve better. People who had never even met her stopped to stand quietly in front of the growing memorial. They had seen Terryn before, a quiet teenager walking home from school with his backpack slung over one shoulder, a boy who mostly kept to himself, a boy who now had to face a reality that no child should ever experience. One evening, just days after the discovery of Terryn's body, family members organized a memorial gathering at a nearby park. Word spread quickly through social media and neighborhood groups. By sunset, dozens of people had arrived. Some carried white balloons. Others brought candles. The winter air was cold, but people stayed anyway. At the center of the crowd stood Terryn. He looked smaller than most people expected. 14 years old, shoulders slightly hunched, hands buried deep in his pockets as relatives and community members gathered around him. Some people tried to speak to him, offering soft words of comfort. Others simply placed a hand on his shoulder. But there are some losses that words cannot reach. When the moment came, a family member stepped forward to speak. Her voice trembled as she talked about Terryn, not as a headline, not as a victim in a police report, but as a mother. She spoke about how hard Terryn had worked, how she was always trying to keep things together for her son, how she laughed loudly and loved fiercely, and how none of them could understand why something so small had ended in something so violent. Because by then, investigators had already revealed the shocking detail that made the case even more disturbing. The alleged motive. $7. When the balloons were finally released into the darkening sky, dozens of white shapes drifted slowly upward, disappearing into the winter above Englewood. For Terryn, it was the moment the truth settled in. His mother wasn't coming home, but grief quickly turned into anger throughout the community. Residents began asking difficult questions. How had a registered sex offender been able to move around the neighborhood so easily? Why had someone with a violent past been living just blocks away from families and children? And perhaps most troubling of all, why had a mother and her teenage son been forced to live inside an abandoned building in the first place? The building itself became a symbol of something larger: neglect, poverty, and the dangerous conditions many families were forced to endure just to have a roof over their heads. Local activists spoke out, demanding better safety measures and stronger monitoring of vacant properties throughout the area. They argued that abandoned buildings often became hiding places for crime, violence, and people who were already known to law enforcement. For them, Terryn's death wasn't just a tragedy. It was a warning. Meanwhile, investigators from the Chicago Police Department were working around the clock. They had a name. They had surveillance footage. They had physical evidence from the scene. But Antoine Chambers had disappeared. After leaving the building on December 9th, he seemed to vanish into the city. Officers began searching shelters, halfway houses, and areas he was known to frequent. Detectives interviewed acquaintances and monitored locations where he might try to return. Days passed, then more days, for Terryn and his family. Each passing day without an arrest felt like an open wound. They knew the man investigators believed was responsible was still somewhere in the same city where they lived, still breathing the same air, still walking the same streets. But on December 19th, 2024, 10 days after Terryn's body had been discovered, that search finally came to an end. Police located Antoine Chambers just a few blocks away from the building where the crime had taken place. He hadn't fled the city. He hadn't even gone very far. officers moved in and took him into custody without incident. For the family, the news brought a complicated mix of emotions: relief, anger, and the painful knowledge that an arrest would not bring Terryn back. Soon after, Chambers appeared in court for the first time. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors began laying out the disturbing details investigators had uncovered. They described the evidence found in the attic, the pipe wrench believed to have been used in the attack, the gray hat left behind at the scene, the surveillance footage showing Chambers entering the building with Terryn and leaving alone. They revealed the Cash App transfer, $7 sent from her phone to his. And perhaps most chilling of all, they told the court about the photos found on Terryn's phone. Images allegedly taken by Chambers after the attack. Images prosecutors described as deeply disturbing. Family members sat silently as each detail was read aloud. For them, every word felt like reopening a wound that had barely begun to heal. When it was time for the judge to make a decision about bail, the courtroom grew quiet. Given the severity of the charges and the evidence presented, the judge ruled that Antoine Chambers would be held without bail while the case moved forward. For Darren's family, it was one small step toward justice. But justice, they knew, would be a long road. Because even with an arrest, even with overwhelming evidence, even with a suspect behind bars, some questions about this tragedy still remained unanswered. Questions about how a man with such a violent past ended up crossing paths with a mother who was simply trying to survive. Questions about how something as small as $7 could spiral into a brutal act of violence. And perhaps the most haunting question of all, how a teenage boy managed to sleep through the night, not knowing that the person he loved most in the world was lying just above him, gone forever. In the weeks after the arrest, life in Englewood slowly began returning to its normal rhythm. The news cameras eventually disappeared. The police tape was taken down. The growing memorial outside the building slowly faded as flowers wilted and candles burned out. But for Darren, nothing about life would ever feel normal again. At just 14 years old, he was forced to face a reality that most people spend an entire lifetime hoping they never encounter. The place he once called home had become the scene of a tragedy. The building where he slept, where he did his homework, where he waited for his mother to come home every evening, had become the place where her life was violently taken. And perhaps the most haunting part of it all was how close he had been to the truth that day. Just above his head, hidden behind a ceiling he never thought to question. For days after the discovery, Darren stayed mostly out of the public eye. Family members stepped in to protect him from the media attention that had suddenly surrounded the case. Reporters had questions, but Darren didn't owe the world his grief. What he needed was space. Space to process, space to mourn, and space to begin rebuilding a life that had been shattered overnight. Eventually, relatives made a decision. Darren would leave Chicago and move to Indiana to live with extended family members. It was meant to give him a fresh start, a place where he could continue school without constantly being reminded of the building, the headlines, and the tragedy that had taken his mother away. For many people who followed the story, the move felt bittersweet. On one hand, it offered Darren a chance to grow up somewhere safer, somewhere quieter. But on the other hand, it also meant leaving behind the city where his mother had lived, worked, struggled, and tried to build a life for the two of them. Because at the center of this case was something that often goes unnoticed in crime headlines: housing instability. Terryn and Darren had been living inside an abandoned building not because they wanted to, but because sometimes survival forces people into impossible situations. Across many cities, abandoned properties become the only shelter some families can find when stable housing slips out of reach. These buildings often exist in the shadows, unsecured, unmonitored, and sometimes filled with dangers that residents never expected. In Englewood, many neighbors pointed out that vacant buildings had long been a problem in the area. They become hiding places, gathering spots, and sometimes entry points for people who are already known to law enforcement. But beyond the housing issue, there was another question that lingered long after the headlines faded. Trust. Investigators believe that in the weeks before the crime, Terryn had allowed Antoine Chambers to spend time around the building. It may have seemed harmless at first, just another person passing through a place where many people came and went. But somewhere along the way, that trust was broken. What started as casual interaction reportedly turned into unwanted attention, then tension, and finally, a confrontation that spiraled into unimaginable violence. $7. That number continues to echo through this case like something out of a nightmare. It's hard for most people to even comprehend how something so small could escalate into something so irreversible. But sometimes violence doesn't follow logic. Sometimes it grows out of frustration, rejection, anger, or wounded pride. And in a single moment, a decision is made that can never be taken back. A life is lost. A family is shattered. A child is left to grow up without the person who protected him the most. For Terryn, the road ahead will be long. He will graduate school someday. He will build friendships, dreams, and a future of his own. But there will always be a piece of his story tied to the winter day when he walked home from school, sensing that something wasn't right, and discovering that the worst had already happened. Cases like this often leave people asking the same question. How could this have been prevented? Was it the lack of safe housing? The gaps in monitoring someone with a violent past? Or simply a tragic intersection of circumstances that no one could have predicted? There are rarely simple answers. But stories like this remind us of how fragile everyday life can be. One moment, everything feels ordinary. A boy leaves for school. A mother starts her day. And somewhere in between, everything changes forever. And now we want to hear from you. What are your thoughts about this case? Do you think more could have been done to prevent a tragedy like this? And have you ever heard of other cases where a small conflict escalated into something far more devastating? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective helps keep these conversations alive. Because behind every true crime story is something deeper than just the headlines. There are real people, real families, and real consequences that continue long after the cameras turn off. If you found this story important or thought-provoking, consider subscribing and joining our growing community here on the True Crime Shadow. Thank you for watching. And until the next case, stay curious, stay aware, and remember that sometimes the darkest stories are hidden in the places we least expect.